In June of 2004, a sitting American president sealed off Sea Island, a private resort on the coast of Georgia, 15 miles north of Jekyll Island. Jekyll was the famous one, the island where the Morgans and Rockefellers wintered, and where a secret meeting drafted the plan that became the Federal Reserve before their Millionaires Club collapsed and the state opened it to anyone with the price of a ticket. Sea Island never opened its gates. George W. Bush chose it to host the leaders of the 8 wealthiest nations for one reason: the public could not reach it. An aircraft carrier lay at anchor 15 miles offshore, the National Guard held the only bridge, and protesters were confined to Savannah, 80 miles north, where no head of state would hear them. The island's director of security would call it the most secure place in the world. He was describing a hotel that had opened in 1928 as, in its founder's words, a friendly little hotel. It was the other Jekyll Island, and it had done the one thing Jekyll never managed. It stayed closed. The Georgia coast does not announce its wealth. Seen from the mainland at Brunswick, the barrier islands rise as low green lines beyond a vast plain of salt marsh, cut off from the highway by tidal creeks and the slow brown rivers that wind through the Spartina grass. The chain runs for roughly 100 miles, from Tybee in the north to Cumberland near the Florida line. The cluster of them near Brunswick, where this story takes place, the promoters long ago gave a gentler name: the Golden Isles. For 3 centuries, the marsh did the work that walls and gates do elsewhere. It kept the islands separate, and it kept them quiet, and it made them valuable to men who wanted both. No island made the point more plainly than Jekyll. In 1886, a group of northern financiers bought the whole of it, close to 6,000 acres, for $125,000 and incorporated themselves as the Jekyll Island Club. Membership was capped at 100 and never raised. The roster came to include the Morgans, the Rockefellers, and the Vanderbilts, and a magazine of the day, surveying the result, called it the richest, the most exclusive, the most inaccessible club in the world. By a reckoning repeated ever since, the club's members represented, all told, something near 1/6 of the wealth of the entire world. What that wealth did on the island is the reason the place is remembered at all. On a November evening in 1910, 6 men traveled south using only their first names in a private rail car, telling anyone who asked that they were bound for a duck hunt. They were a senator, an assistant secretary of the Treasury, and 4 of the most powerful financiers in the country, and over the following days, inside the clubhouse on Jekyll Island, they drafted the plan that would become the Federal Reserve System. The meeting was held so closely that the men denied it had happened for the better part of 20 years. A decision that would shape the next century of American money was made on a Georgia barrier island precisely because no one could follow them there. The numbers of the place still read like the ledger of a vanished order: $125,000 for an entire island, 100 members, and not one more. 1/6 of the world's wealth gathered, by the old telling, in a single dining room at the dinner hour. 6 men and 1 secret bill. A clubhouse, the magazines agreed, was the most inaccessible in the world. And then, after the season of 1942, nothing. The Depression had thinned the membership, and the Second World War closed the island for good. The club never opened another season. In 1947, the state of Georgia took Jekyll through condemnation proceedings, paid the remaining members $675,000, and opened the most inaccessible club in the world to anyone who could afford a day at the beach. The gate that had kept a continent out was simply removed. Jekyll Island became a state park, and the order it had been built to guard dissolved into picnic tables and a sea turtle center and a hotel where the cottages of the Morgans could be rented by the night. But 15 miles to the north, on the same chain of marsh and tide, a second island had been quietly assembled while Jekyll was still at its height, and it would not end the way Jekyll ended. Its founders did not call it a club. They called it a resort, and they named its hotel the Cloister, after the enclosed and private heart of a monastery. And when it opened in 1928, its founder described it, with deliberate modesty, as a friendly little hotel. The description was a form of camouflage. What rose on Sea Island over the following century was neither friendly nor little. It was the thing Jekyll had been, and could no longer manage to remain. A private island that stayed private, governed by 3 words its own chroniclers would later use without embarrassment: privacy, security, and discretion. Jekyll's 100 millionaires had needed their island only for the winter. The family that built Sea Island would come to need it for everything, and would hold it against depression and war and their own near ruin for the better part of 100 years. The man who began it was no heir to any of the great fortunes that had wintered down the coast. He was an engineer from an Ohio farm, and he would not live to see what his island became. His name was Howard Coffin. He had made automobiles. Coffin had not been born to machines, but he found them early. He came into the world in 1873 on a farm near West Milton, Ohio, the son of a Quaker family, and he was still a student of engineering at the University of Michigan when he built a steam-powered carriage that he drove through the streets of Ann Arbor to deliver the mail. His was the kind of mind that preferred a problem with a single correct answer. By 1902, he was the chief experimental engineer at Oldsmobile, and within a few years its chief engineer, and in 1909 he joined a group of Detroit men who pooled their talent and their capital, took the name and the money of the department store magnate Joseph Hudson, and founded the Hudson Motor Car Company. Their first car, the Model 20, was a 4-cylinder machine that sold for around $900, built on the conviction that a motor car should cost a working man less than $1,000. More than 4,000 of them sold in the first year, the best first year showing the young American auto industry had yet seen. The car made Coffin a wealthy man, but his lasting mark on the industry was not any single car. It was order. In a trade of hundreds of small makers, each cutting its own bolts and guarding its own patents, Coffin argued for a common set of standards, interchangeable parts and shared specifications and pooled designs, and as a founder and early president of the Society of Automotive Engineers, he largely got them. The industry remembered him by a title that suited the man exactly: the father of standardization. When the country went to war in 1917, the same instinct carried him to Washington, where he chaired the board that organized the nation's aircraft production and led an inventory of American industrial capacity that had never before been attempted. Coffin's gift was for taking a sprawling, disorderly thing and making it run as a single machine. What drew him to Georgia was, fittingly, a race. The early carmakers tested their machines in public contests, and in 1911 Coffin came south to watch his automobiles run on the road course at Savannah. He stayed to fish, and he did not entirely leave again. The Georgia coast in those years was a half-wild country of marsh and tidal river and pine, its old cotton plantations gone to ruin since the Civil War, its barrier islands cheap and quiet, and largely emptied of the fortunes that had once worked them. To a man who saw the world as a system waiting to be rationalized, it was not a paradise. It was a project. He began with Sapelo, 60 miles south of Savannah, the 4th largest of the Georgia islands. In 1912 he bought it, some 20,000 acres of upland and marsh, for somewhere between $120,000 and $150,000. He bought very nearly the whole of the island. He did not buy all of it. Scattered across Sapelo were the small landholdings of black families, descendants of the people who had been enslaved on its plantations and who had remained after freedom, farming and fishing the ground they had been given or had bought. Coffin acquired everything around them. Those few hundred acres he could not fold into his system, and for the time being he left them where they stood. On the south end of Sapelo lay the tabby ruin of a mansion built a century before by the antebellum planter Thomas Spaulding. In the 1920s, Coffin rebuilt it from its old foundations into a palatial house in the Spanish and Mediterranean manner, with statuary and an indoor pool and broad, cool rooms that would later be painted with murals. He blasted drainage ditches through the marshes, cleared the long fallow fields, laid miles of roads paved with crushed oyster shell, and built a cannery. Sapelo was the rehearsal. The style of that house, white stucco and red tile and shaded arcade, was the style that would shortly define a hotel 15 miles to the south. Coffin and his wife Matilda had no children of their own. Sometime in the 1920s, Coffin brought in a young cousin named Alfred Jones, whom everyone called Bill, to help him manage his growing ventures on the coast, and Jones stayed. The childless Coffins took to him as to a son, and Coffin, who conceived projects faster than he could ever finish them, found in Jones the one element his system had lacked, a man who could complete what he began. Coffin would draw up the plans and arrange the money. Jones would make them real. By the middle of the decade, Coffin's ambition had outgrown a private island kept for himself. He wanted to build something that other people of means could buy their way into, a colony of cottages and a grand hotel on a thin sand island just east of St. Simon's that the maps still labeled Long Island. He would not call it that for long. Long Island was a poor name for what Coffin intended, and in 1926 he changed it. He had begun that year buying tracts on St. Simon's, the larger island to the west, and when he acquired the thin strip of sand and marsh beyond it, he renamed the strip Sea Island. The choice was not idle. Sea Island cotton was the name of the long staple crop that had made these islands rich a century earlier, the finest and most expensive cotton grown anywhere in America. And to fix that name to a resort was to borrow quietly the prestige of a vanished and profitable world. The men who had grown that cotton and the people who had been forced to pick it did not appear in the brochures. First, though, the island had to be reached. Coffin financed the repair of the causeway that crossed the marsh to St. Simon's so that a motor car could drive from the mainland nearly to the sea. He cut 22 miles of new roads and handed them to the county. He started a bus line that ran the length of the coast from Savannah down to Jacksonville by way of Brunswick. He brought the island its first electric power plant, along with a water system and a telephone exchange. The engineer who had standardized an industry now wired a wild stretch of Georgia into a single working machine, and at the center of the machine he set a hotel. He set it, deliberately, on a plantation. In 1926, Coffin bought Retreat, a former cotton estate on St. Simon's, whose fields had grown Sea Island cotton under the management of a planter's wife named Anna Page King, and the labor of the people she owned. The plantation house stood in ruins. Its long entrance drive, an avenue of live oaks set in their rows generations earlier by enslaved hands, did not. Coffin laid a golf course over the old fields and hired Walter Travis, the first American to win the British Amateur, to design it. The oaks the enslaved had planted became the ornament of the 18th hole. For the hotel itself, Coffin turned to the most fashionable and most ruined architect in America. Addison Meisner had spent the early 1920s making himself the favorite builder of Palm Beach society, conjuring Spanish and Mediterranean palaces of pink stucco and red tile for the very rich. Then he had overreached. In 1925, he formed a corporation to build an entire dream city at Boca Raton, took millions from backers who included Irving Berlin and a DuPont, and watched the Florida land boom collapse beneath him before the paint was dry. By 1927, his company was bankrupt, and his creditors were paid a tenth of a penny on the dollar. The centerpiece of that lost dream had been a 100-room hotel on a Florida lake, which Meisner had named, in a flourish of monastic make-believe, the Cloister. So, when Coffin hired him to design the Sea Island Hotel, Meisner brought the name with him. He proposed that this hotel, too, be called the Cloister, after the enclosed and contemplative heart of a monastery, the part of the building reserved for men who had renounced the world. It was a strange word for a resort whose entire purpose was to gather the world's wealthy in one comfortable place, and stranger still, coming from a man who furnished his hotels, by his own cheerful account, as a kind of magnificent thief. "I have looted cathedrals, churches, and palaces," Meisner once said of his method. Coffin took the name without objection. Construction began in 1927. Meisner gave Coffin a low, sprawling building of white stucco and terracotta tile, set back from the ocean among the live oaks and the palms, with a high-beamed Spanish lounge and shaded interior courts. It had only 46 rooms. It was never meant to overwhelm. It was meant to feel like a private house that happened to be very large, and it did that so well that its founder could describe it, without quite lying, as a friendly little hotel. The Cloister opened on the 12th of October, 1928, with a flurry of dignitaries in attendance. Thousands motored across the new causeway to see it. The reviews were admiring, the bookings immediate, and within the year there were more requests for rooms than the 46 could hold. The colony of private cottages Coffin had drawn began to fill the 3-mile drive down the center of the island, sold to families who wanted exactly what the island offered: quiet, distance, a gate. 10 weeks after the doors opened, the most important guest of all arrived to plant a tree. The president was Calvin Coolidge, and he came in December of 1928, in the last winter of his presidency. He had declined to run again, and Herbert Hoover had already been elected to succeed him, so the man who arrived at the Cloister for the holidays was a president with a few months left to serve and, by reputation, very little to say. They called him Silent Cal. He came to rest and to fish and to be photographed, and the young Sea Island Company, 10 weeks into its existence, understood the value of the photograph. On the south lawn of the hotel, before the cameras, Coolidge planted a young oak. It was a small ceremony and a shrewd one. A president had blessed the place in the most rooted way available to him by setting a living thing into its soil, and the image traveled through the newspapers as the company had hoped it would. What no one announced was that the tree was wrong. By one account, the sapling handed to the president was a water oak, a quicker-growing and shorter-lived species rather than the hardy live oak the occasion called for. And when the error was noticed, the company's landscapist crept onto the lawn in the dark and exchanged the 2 saplings before morning. Coolidge never knew. The first monument to the island's permanence was founded, quietly, on a substitution. The ceremony Coolidge began did not end with him. Over the decades that followed, the planting of a tree became the island's way of marking the visit of anyone who mattered, and the list of those who mattered grew long. A president would arrive, or a king or a queen, and at some point in the stay would be led out to the lawn and handed a spade, and another oak would go into the ground with a small brass marker beside it. In time, the lawns and drives of Sea Island held the Coolidge oak and the Eisenhower oak and the Queen Juliana oak, named for the Queen of the Netherlands, among many others. It was a guest book that breathed, a register of power written not in ink, but in living wood, rooted in the soil of a single island, so that a visitor walking the grounds could read, tree by tree, the names of everyone the 20th century had agreed to call important. Coolidge's own visit, fittingly, spanned both of Coffin's islands. After the Cloister, the President and Mrs. Coolidge crossed to Sapelo to stay in the great Spanish house Coffin had raised from the Spaulding ruins, where they were photographed on the porch with their host and a chow dog named Tiny Tim. The same coast that had been a half-wild backwater 15 years earlier now received the President of the United States in 2 houses in a single season. But the ritual of the planted oak carried within it a forgetting. A few miles from the Cloister lawn, where Coolidge turned his spade, stood another avenue of oaks, older and grander than any a president would ever plant. It ran the length of the entrance drive of Retreat, the cotton plantation Coffin had bought and turned to golf, and it had been set there generations before by people whose labor was owned and whose names were kept in no register at all. The island, from its very first winter, had begun keeping a careful account of the powerful who came to admire it, of the people who had made its ground, who had cleared its fields and dug its ditches and planted, by their own hands, the very oaks the new arrivals found so beautiful it kept no account. 2 kinds of oak now grew on the same islands. One was planted by presidents and marked with their names in brass. The other had been planted by the enslaved and marked with nothing. To understand what Sea Island was, a visitor would have had to walk back down the older avenue, past the brass markers, to the ground the resort had been built across. Retreat was older than the resort by more than a century. In 1804, a planter named William Page bought land on the southwestern tip of St. Simon's and gave it its name, and over the following decades it grew into one of the great plantations of the island, its fields given over to the crop that made the Georgia coast wealthy. Sea Island cotton was a long staple variety, its fibers longer and silkier and stronger than ordinary cotton, and it commanded the highest prices in the world. It also demanded an enormous amount of skilled hand labor, and that labor was supplied by people who were owned. When Page died in 1827, his only child, Anna Matilda, inherited Retreat. She had married a Massachusetts-born lawyer named Thomas Butler King, and while King pursued the career that the wealth of the plantation made possible, serving in the Georgia Senate and then a decade in the United States Congress, where he led the effort to build up the American Navy, his wife ran the plantation and the people enslaved upon it. By 1835, Retreat alone was home to as many as 355 enslaved men, women, and children. The figures of that older economy are worth holding in the mind beside the figures of the resort. 355 enslaved people on Retreat, more than 500 on Pierce Butler's plantation at the north end of the island, more than 4,000 across the plantations of St. Simon's at the height of the cotton era. A crop that sold for the highest price of any cotton on earth, picked by people who were paid nothing for it. As late as 1920, a full century after the Kings, black residents still made up close to 70% of the people on St. Simon's. Today, there are perhaps 50. The evidence of that world did not vanish when the resort arrived. It was paved over, or repurposed, or left standing as ornament. At Retreat, the field hands had lived in a quarter called New Field, a street of 8 tabby cabins, each 48 feet by 18, set 300 feet apart beneath the live oaks. The people who lived in them tilled the Sea Island cotton in the fields nearby. One of those cabins still stands at the corner of Frederica and Demere Roads. It has been converted into a gift shop. The plantation's ruins and its cemetery now edge the fairways of the Sea Island Golf Club, and the avenue of oaks down which the members drive to play was the plantation's entrance road, planted by the enslaved. The people who had worked that ground were Gullah Geechee, the descendants of West and Central Africans brought to the Sea Islands in chains. The very isolation that would later make the islands attractive to a resort had, in the generations before, allowed those communities to keep more of their African language and faith and custom than almost anywhere else in the country. When the planters fled at the start of the Civil War and abandoned their plantations, the people they had enslaved remained on the land and made it their own. Their resistance to enslavement is written into the geography of the island itself. In May of 1803, a year before William Page bought Retreat, a cargo of 75 Igbo captives from West Africa was sold at the Savannah slave market to agents acting for 2 coastal planters, John Cooper and Thomas Spaulding, the same Spaulding whose Sapelo mansion coffin would one day rebuild. Loaded below the deck of a small vessel for the passage down to St. Simon's, the Igbo rose in revolt, forced their captors into the water, and ran the boat aground in Dunbar Creek. Rather than be taken into slavery, a number of them, 10 or 12 by the contemporary accounts, walked deliberately into the marsh and drowned. In the oral tradition handed down by their descendants, their leader spoke as they went into the water. "The water brought us here. The water will take us away." The place is called Igbo Landing. The survivors of that rebellion were carried off to the plantations of Cannon's Point and Sapelo. The island coffin would buy a little more than a century later. This was the ground the resort had been built across, and these were the people whose descendants still lived along its edges. They had not gone anywhere. In the decades to come, on Sapelo above all, the question of whether they could remain on the land their ancestors had been brought to in chains would become one of the longest and quietest struggles on the Georgia coast, and it would still be unresolved in the present century. But in the autumn of 1928, none of that troubled the new hotel. The Cloister was full, the cottages were selling, a president had planted his tree, and the future looked as settled as the live oaks. It would take almost exactly 1 year for that to come apart. The crash came in October of 1929, almost exactly a year after the Cloister had opened its doors. The fortune coffin had made in automobiles and poured into the Georgia coast was suddenly exposed, and the resort he had built faced a particular danger. It depended for its survival on the leisure of the rich, and the rich were, for the first time in a generation, no longer certain of their wealth. Cottages stopped selling. The bookings thinned. A business built entirely on the confidence of the prosperous met a country that had lost its confidence overnight. Then the losses turned personal. On the 26th of February, 1932, Matilda Coffin died. She had been with her husband through all of it, had bought Sapelo at his side and been photographed with the Coolidges on its porch, and her death took something out of him that the markets had not yet reached. He married again, a New Yorker named Gladys Baker, but the ground had shifted under him, and it kept shifting. By the middle of the decade, the engineer who had wired an entire coast into a single working system could no longer afford to own all of it. He faced a choice that the coastal historian Buddy Sullivan would later put in the starkest terms. Coffin could save the resort, or he could save Sapelo, but not both. He could give up the hotel he had built for others, or the island he had built for himself. He chose to keep the resort. In 1934, he sold Sapelo, the first of his islands, the rehearsal for everything that followed, the place where a president had stayed in a house Coffin had raised from a ruin. The buyer was a young man of not yet 30 named Richard Joshua Reynolds, Jr., heir to the tobacco fortune of Winston-Salem, North Carolina. He bought Sapelo as a private retreat, much as Coffin had, and he would keep it for 30 years. During that time he did to the island's black communities what Coffin had only declined to do. He gathered them up. The descendants of the enslaved had built several settlements across Sapelo after the Civil War, with names like Raccoon Bluff and Shell Hammock and Bell Marsh, and Reynolds consolidated them through a series of land exchanges into a single community at a place called Hog Hammock. Their scattered holdings, the land their ancestors had kept when Coffin bought everything around it, were drawn into one smaller place. Reynolds himself died in 1964 at 58 of emphysema. His fortune had been built on cigarettes. Coffin did not live to see any of it. On the 21st of November, 1937, at Sea Island, he died of a gunshot wound from his favorite rifle. He was 64. The death was recorded as an accident, and an accident it may have been. But it came at the close of several years in which he had lost his fortune, lost his first wife, and sold the island he loved most, and those who have traced the arc of his last seasons have not all been willing to call it chance. The record does not settle the question. What is certain is that the man who had imagined a paradise of permanence on the Georgia coast did not last to see whether it would hold. He was buried beside Matilda in the churchyard at Christ Church on St. Simon's, a few miles from the plantation oaks and the Cloister lawn. There was a bleak symmetry in it. Coffin had spent his working life as the great rationalizer of American industry, the man who took disorderly things and made them run as a single machine, and his peers had called him the father of standardization. At the end, he could not keep his own fortune or his own life in any kind of order. The island he had built to outlast everyone outlasted him within a decade of its opening. But it did outlast him, and that was the point. The Cloister was still standing, still taking guests, still selling cottages to families who wanted a gate between themselves and the world. And it had passed into the hands of the one man Coffin had trusted to finish what he began. The cousin who had come south to work at his side, whom the childless Coffins had loved as a son, now held what was left of the empire. Bill Jones was still a relatively young man. He would spend the rest of his life proving that Sea Island could do the one thing its founder could not: endure. Jones inherited Sea Island in 1937, and with it the rule that the company would be run, from then on, by his family. What he inherited was not yet a fortune. It was a beautiful and barely solvent hotel on an island in the middle of the worst economic decade in American history, and to keep it alive, Jones resorted to measures that would have impressed his cousin, the engineer. During the leanest years, he had the Sea Island Company print its own scrip, a private paper money, to pay its workers, and he arranged that every grocery store and drugstore and filling station in the county would honor it. For a time, on the Georgia coast, a private resort issued the currency that a county spent. It worked. The resort survived the Depression, survived the war that followed, and in 1941, 13 years after the Cloister first opened its doors, Sea Island turned a profit for the first time. From there, the climb was steady. The hotel that Coffin had called a friendly little hotel became, over the following decades, one of the few five-star resorts in the country, and the guest book filled with the kind of names the planted oaks were meant to commemorate. Presidents came, as they had since Coolidge. Hoover came, and Ford, and Carter. General Eisenhower came in the year after the war, before the country made him president. Royalty came. Sarah Churchill, the daughter of Winston Churchill, was married on the island in 1949. Margaret Thatcher came in time, and John D. Rockefeller, Jr., of the family that had once wintered down the coast at Jekyll. And in 1945, among the thousands of ordinary honeymooners who could afford a week at the Cloister, came a young naval officer just back from the Pacific and his bride, George and Barbara Bush. They would return for their 50th anniversary. The name would matter later. The figures of the rise are worth setting down. 13 years from opening to first profit. A private currency honored across an entire county. A guest list that ran from Coolidge to Thatcher. A run of five-star ratings the resort would eventually claim was unmatched by any hotel in the country. And, in time, 1,400 employees, which made the Sea Island Company the largest private employer on the Georgia coast. Through all of it, Bill Jones did something his guests rarely noticed. He gave the public the coast. He had a conservationist's instincts and a developer's reach, and he used them together. With Coffin, in 1936, he had pressed Georgia's congressman to make the colonial ruins of Fort Frederica a national monument. He gave Fort King George to the state. And when the developer who had built Hilton Head began buying up Cumberland Island, the last great undeveloped barrier island on the coast, with plans to cover it in condominiums, it was Jones who stopped him by persuading the Mellon Foundation to put up $7.5 million to buy the island for the nation. Cumberland Island National Seashore exists today, open to anyone who can reserve a ferry ticket, in large part because Bill Jones made a telephone call to the Mellons. By one account, his hand could be found as well on Jekyll Island, on Fort King George, on a dozen parks and churches up and down the coast. There was a contradiction in this that Jones seems never to have regarded as one. The same man who spent his life opening the Georgia coast to the public spent it, with equal devotion, perfecting the one stretch of that coast the public could not enter. He preserved Cumberland for everyone and Sea Island for almost no one. The gate he kept at Sea Island and the gates he tore down everywhere else were, to him, parts of the same work. A man should give generously to the world and keep one perfect island out of it. But a perfect island does not keep itself. Behind the gate, the labor of making Sea Island flawless, the grounds and the kitchens and the laundries and the nurseries fell to a workforce that was very large and very largely black, and that did not appear in the photographs of the planted oaks. They lived, most of them, in a separate world a few miles from the cottages. Their story is the one the brochures were built to leave out. The people who kept Sea Island perfect had been on these islands far longer than the resort. After the Civil War, the formerly enslaved of St. Simon's had done what the enslaved were rarely given the chance to do. They had bought land. On the northern half of the island, on ground their families had worked in bondage, they built their own neighborhoods, 3 of which took names: Harrington, South End, and one the island called Jewtown. For a time, they were the island. Well into the 20th century, black residents made up roughly 3/4 of the people on St. Simon's, and they worked the sawmills and the trades, and when the resort rose on the island next door, they worked that too, its grounds and its kitchens, its laundries and its nurseries. Segregation turned their communities into worlds unto themselves. Harrington had its own store and its own gas station, a barber shop, 2 churches, and a restaurant called the Plantation Supper Club. It had its own school. The Harrington School, a modest frame building put up in the 1920s, taught the children of all three communities from the first grade through the seventh, after which they went to the mainland until desegregation in the 1960s finally closed it and bussed the children away. For 4 decades, the children of the people who raked the fairways and pressed the linen of a 5-star resort learned their letters in a single room a few miles up the road. The resort could not have run without them. At its height, the Sea Island Company employed 1,400 people, which made it the largest private employer on the Georgia coast. And the flawlessness the guests came to admire, the swept paths and the turned-down beds, and the children minded while their parents played golf, was the daily work of a workforce drawn heavily from these communities and almost entirely absent from the photographs. The barrier islands earned a reputation over those years that was rarely printed and widely understood. They were places for wealthy white families and the people who served them. There was a symmetry in the isolation that few on either side would have named. The same distance from the mainland that the resort sold to its guests as privacy was, for the families in Harrington, the isolation of a segregated world, a few miles and an entire century removed from the cottages. 2 populations lived on the same handful of islands, sharing the same marsh and the same oaks, divided by nearly everything else. And then the ground beneath the older communities began to move. Through the second half of the century, and above all in the 1990s, developers turned toward the historic black neighborhoods, and the land that freed people had bought with such difficulty began to be sold off, lot by lot, for subdivisions. Some families took the money, others refused, and planted handmade yellow signs in their yards that carried 3 words: "Don't ask, won't sell." One of the new subdivisions took the name Retreat after the plantation, and rose on the very ground where the enslaved had grown the island's cotton. St. Simon's, which had once been 3/4 black, became an island of more than 12,000 residents who were overwhelmingly white, its black population worn down to a small and aging remnant. Almost everything that older world had built was sold, or paved, or lost. One thing was saved, and it was saved by the descendants themselves. The abandoned Harrington School was rescued by a coalition of the island's black families, among them a woman named Amy Roberts, whose own ancestors had been enslaved on Retreat, and in 2017 it reopened as a cultural center, a museum of the people the brochures had been built to leave out. The island had kept, from its very first winter, a careful register of the powerful. The people who had made its ground were left, in the end, to keep their own. Behind the gate, none of this disturbed the orderly business of succession. While the families of Harrington were losing the land their grandparents had bought, the Jones family was passing down the land their cousin had assembled 1 generation to the next, exactly as the founder had intended. The island was becoming an inheritance. Coffin, who had wanted permanence above all things, had died without children to inherit it. The permanence he did not get, his cousin's family supplied. Bill Jones held Sea Island for nearly 30 years after the founder's death, and when he handed it on, he handed it to his son. In the mid-1960s, Alfred W. Jones, Jr. took over the running of the company, and in the early 1990s, the 3rd generation stepped forward, when Alfred W. Jones III, known like his grandfather as Bill, took over the running of the company. 3 men of one family, carrying nearly the same name, held the same island across the better part of a century. It was the dynasty Coffin had imagined and had not lived to found. The continuity was not incidental. It was the product. The Joneses sold Sea Island the way a family sells a home that happens to have 500 guests in it, and each generation cultivated the same unhurried manner, the same gentleman's devotion to the sporting life, the same insistence that the island grow slowly, if it grew at all. Where the developers of Hilton Head and Miami had covered their coasts in high-rises, the Joneses held Sea Island to low buildings and wide lawns and a strict, almost fussy sense of taste. The gate was part of it. So were the dress codes, which governed the dining rooms and even the tennis courts. A guest was not merely buying a room, he was buying his way, for a week, into a family's idea of how the world ought to be ordered. Beneath the manners, the company grew into something large. Under the second and third generations, the Sea Island Company expanded well beyond the original hotel, onto St. Simon's and the islands around it. It rebuilt its golf, handing the founders modest courses to celebrated designers who turned 4 short 9-hole layouts into 2 long championship ones. It added private clubs with their own gates inside the gate, Ocean Forest and Frederica, for those who found the Cloister insufficiently exclusive. It built a spa, and as the new century opened, it built the Lodge, a second grand hotel on the golf links in the same Spanish and Mediterranean style Meisner had carried up from the wreck of Boca Raton 70 years before. The friendly little hotel had become a small empire of hotels. The third generation had the founder's appetite for scale. Bill Jones III did not speak of running a fine resort. He spoke of running the finest one on earth. His stated ambition, set down plainly, was for Sea Island to be the #1 resort in the world, and he pursued it with the low-density conservationism of his father and the grand, expensive vision of his grandfather's cousin, the founder. The two impulses did not always sit easily together. A man who wishes to keep an island quiet and a man who wishes to make it the most celebrated resort on the planet are not always the same man, even when they share a name and a body. And there was one thing about Sea Island that a chief executive of grand ambition could not overlook. The Cloister itself, the low white hotel that Coolidge had blessed and that had given the island its fame, was, by the turn of the century, more than 70 years old. Meisner had built it quickly, as a structure meant to test the market, and it had never been given a proper foundation. It had survived 7 decades of storms and salt air, more or less on faith. To a man who intended to build the #1 resort in the world, an aging, foundationless hotel was not a monument to be preserved. It was a problem to be solved. And the solution he arrived at was the one that would, in the end, cost his family the island. He decided to tear the Cloister down. He would not renovate it. He would erase it and build it again. The original Cloister, Jones concluded, was beyond saving. Meisner had thrown it up in 1927 as a temporary structure, and 7 decades later it had no proper foundation, did not meet modern building codes, and was, in the plain assessment of the men who inspected it, falling down. To most owners of a beloved and famous hotel, that would have been an argument for careful restoration. To Bill Jones III, it was an argument for demolition. He would take the founder's hotel apart and set a larger, sturdier, more luxurious one in its place, and he would make the new one look as though it had always stood there. There was a paradox at the center of the plan, and Jones did not flinch from it. The entire value of Sea Island lay in its history, in the feeling that a guest was staying in the very rooms where Coolidge had wintered and presidents had planted their oaks. To protect that feeling, Jones proposed to destroy the actual historic building. He hired an architect named Peter Capone and gave him a single strange instruction: Capone was to design not a new hotel, but the hotel Addison Meisner himself would have built, had Meisner been building something meant to last. The new Cloister would be a replica of a building that had never quite existed, an idealized memory of the original, rendered in stone. One piece of the founder's hotel was judged too precious to lose. Meisner's Spanish lounge, the high-beamed public room at the heart of the old Cloister, was taken apart by hand, board by board, and window by window, its mantel and its ceiling catalogued and stored, and then reassembled inside the new building exactly as it had been. Of the entire hotel that Coolidge had blessed, a single room was carried across like a relic into its replacement. To make the rest feel as old as that one room, Jones spent without apparent limit. He wanted timber that looked the way timber had looked when the original was built, and so he sent men to drag thousand-year-old logs from the bottoms of southern rivers where they had lain preserved in the cold since being felled a century before. He commissioned 670 rugs, woven by hand in the mountain villages of Turkey. A designer bought 3,000 antiques from around the world to fill the rooms. The new Cloister was set 150 feet nearer the river than the old one, and where Meisner's hotel had held 46 rooms, the replica would hold 100, with butlers standing by for its finest suites. When the accounting was finished, the cost of making Sea Island permanent came to $500 million. It was, in its way, the founder's own philosophy carried to its logical end. Coffin had wanted permanence above all things. His heirs had now borrowed $500 million to manufacture it, tearing down the one genuinely old building on the island in order to replace it with something that would look old forever. The whole hotel had become what Coolidge's Oak had been at the very beginning, a monument to permanence founded on a substitution. The plan to pay for it was simple and rested on a single assumption. The Sea Island Company still owned vast stretches of undeveloped Georgia coast, and it would sell that land, parcel by parcel, to the wealthy people who wanted to live near the #1 resort in the world. The $500 million would be repaid out of the rising value of American land. It was a reasonable wager in the years it was made. It depended entirely on land continuing to rise, but the demolition would wait a little longer. Before the wrecking crews came for the old Cloister, the hotel that Coffin built had one last guest to receive, and it would be the most powerful gathering the island had ever held. In the summer of 2004, the President of the United States brought the rulers of the world to Sea Island. In July of 2003, the White House announced that the 30th meeting of the Group of Eight, the leaders of the world's wealthiest industrial nations, would be held the following June on Sea Island. The decision was not about comfort, and it was not about scenery. It was about security. The recent summits had been besieged. At Genoa in 2001, the streets had become a battlefield, and a protester had been shot dead by the police. At Evian the year after, the demonstrations had run for miles. The administration of George W. Bush wanted, for the summit it would host, a place that protesters simply could not reach, and there was no better candidate in the United States than a private island joined to the mainland by a single causeway, with the ocean on every other side. The choice was also, quietly, a family matter. Bush's parents had honeymooned at the Cloister in 1945, the young naval officer and his bride, and had come back for their 50th anniversary. For 60 years the family had treated Sea Island as a place of their own. Now the sun was bringing the rulers of the earth to the island his parents had loved. What descended on the Georgia coast in the first week of June was the largest security operation the region had ever seen. The Department of Homeland Security designated the summit a National Special Security event, the same category it reserved for presidential inaugurations. Governor Sonny Perdue declared a state of emergency across 6 counties. More than 10,000 federal, state, and local officers took up positions by land, by sea, and by air. The Coast Guard patrolled the surrounding waters. The National Guard held the bridge. The Secret Service held the gate. And 15 miles offshore, riding at anchor with its battle fleet, sat a warship, the amphibious assault ship Iwo Jima, a vessel that carried its own aircraft, ready at a moment's notice. The island's own former director of security would describe the result in a single phrase. Sea Island, he said, was the most secure place in the world. The figures of the lockdown still read like the order of battle for a small war. 10,000 officers guarding a 5-mile island by land, sea, and air. A state of emergency across 6 counties. 1 warship and its fleet, 15 miles out. The Coast Guard on the water, the Guard on the bridge, the Secret Service at the gate. 450 radio handsets contracted merely to coordinate the preparations, and every protester in America who wished to be heard held 80 miles up the coast in Savannah. For the geography did to the protests what no police line ever could. The demonstrators who came were confined to Savannah and to the Brunswick side of the bridge, well out of the sight and hearing of any head of state. When a group of them marched toward the island, they were met by a security fence and by National Guardsmen who were, at that moment, handing out bottles of water. They sat down before the gate for about 20 minutes, and then most of them boarded air-conditioned buses and rode back to Brunswick. It was the quietest G8 protest in years, not because the anger had gone, but because the island had been built across 3/4 of a century to make that anger irrelevant. So complete was the presence that some in the area came to believe martial law had been declared. There was a rhyme in it that almost no one noticed. 76 years earlier, when the Cloister was still going up, the company had moored a refurbished 3-story warship at its dock to serve as a floating hotel for the resort's very first guests. Now, a warship lay off Sea Island once again. In 1928, it had been there to house the arriving rich. In 2004, it was there to shield the arriving powerful from everyone else. The island had received a president once before, and the difference between the 2 visits measured everything the place had become. Coolidge had come in 1928 across a brand-new causeway that any curious citizen could drive, to plant a sapling and pose for the cameras and be seen. Bush came in 2004 to a causeway that no citizen could cross in order not to be reached. The first president had used the island to be photographed. The second used it to disappear. Between the oak-planting president and the island-sealing president lay the whole distance the island had traveled, from a friendly little hotel to the most secure place on earth. For 3 days, the 8 most powerful men in the world sat together on Sea Island, unreachable, and discussed the fate of a great many people who could not get near them. They adopted a plan against the spread of nuclear weapons. They committed to train 75,000 peacekeepers for the world's wars. They spoke of the Middle East, of famine in the Horn of Africa, of vaccines for diseases that were killing millions. Ronald Reagan had died 3 days before the summit opened, and when it ended, several of the leaders flew on to Washington for his state funeral. The old Cloister had hosted the most consequential gathering in its history, and it had done so by being precisely what Coffin and 3 generations of Joneses had spent their lives making it, a place the public could not follow. It was the island's greatest moment. It was also the last full season of the hotel that Coffin built, and the beginning of the end of the family that held it. After the leaders left, the wrecking crews came. The old Cloister, the low white hotel that Coolidge had blessed and that had just held the most powerful men on earth, was pulled down. In its place rose the replica, larger and grander, and set nearer the river, and in the autumn of 2006, it opened its doors. Bill Jones marked the occasion with one last decision. He closed the island's streets. For 78 years, the curious public had been permitted to drive across the causeway, roll slowly past the cottages, and look at the famous hotel from the road. Now the roads were made private, the gate was staffed, and only guests and residents could pass. 2 years after a president had sealed the island for a weekend, the family sealed it for good. The whole of it had been financed on a single wager. The $500 million would be repaid, the company reasoned, by selling its vast holdings of undeveloped Georgia coast to wealthy buyers who wanted to live beside the finest resort in the world. The plan required only that American land keep rising in value, as it had done, more or less, for as long as anyone could remember. It stopped rising in 2007, and in 2008 it fell. The financial panic struck Sea Island from every direction at once. The land the company needed to sell would not sell. The buyers for the new luxury development did not appear. Resort bookings dropped, home purchases stalled, and the revenue of the Cloister itself fell by nearly a third in 2 years. The company defaulted on loans that would later be judged unwise from the day they were signed. And the firm that had once printed its own money to keep its workers employed through the Depression now did the opposite. It let about a quarter of them go. The figures of the collapse are worth setting against the figures of the rise. $500 million borrowed to make the island permanent. Cloister revenue down by nearly a third in 2 years. By the end of 2009, assets of some $600 million against debts of more than $800 million. A quarter of the workforce dismissed. And, at the last, a sale price of $212 million, less than half of what the company had spent tearing down and rebuilding a single hotel. In 2010, the Sea Island Company filed for bankruptcy. The island that had been held by one family for the better part of a century, from Coffin's death straight down through 3 generations of Joneses, passed out of the family's hands. It was bought for $212 million by a group of investment firms, among them Oak Tree Capital, Avenue Capital, Starwood, and the Anschutz Corporation, and by 2016, the Anschutz family, which also owned the Broadmoor in Colorado, held it outright. The dynasty Coffin had imagined and the Joneses had built was finished. Bill Jones III had reached, at the end, for the #1 resort in the world, and the reaching had cost his family the island itself. And here, at last, the 2 islands that had begun the same way parted for good. Jekyll and Sea Island had both been raised on the same coast in the same decades by men who wanted the same thing, a private world the public could not enter. Both of those worlds, in time, collapsed. But when the order that ruled Jekyll fell, the state of Georgia took the island and opened its gate to anyone who could pay for a day at the beach. When the family that ruled Sea Island fell, no gate opened. The island simply changed hands. It passed intact from a family to a consortium and then to another billionaire. Its causeway still guarded, its beach still private, its rooms still priced beyond nearly everyone alive. Jekyll had become a state park. Sea Island had merely found a new landlord. That was the whole difference, and it was the thing the founder had wanted from the beginning. Coffin and the Joneses had failed to keep the island in the way they had meant to. The dynasty did not survive. But the thing they built to outlast them did precisely that. The private island endured, the family that made it did not. In America, it turned out, power did not need any one family to hold it. It needed only a place the public could not follow, and the place would always find new hands. Up the coast, in the next county to the north, on the first island Coffin had ever bought, that same question of who endures on the land and who is moved off it had never stopped being asked. On Sapelo it was being asked still. Sapelo lies up the coast from Sea Island, in the next county to the north, and it followed a different course. After Coffin sold it in 1934, the tobacco heir Reynolds kept it as a private retreat for 30 years, until his death, and in time his widow sold it to the state of Georgia. Today the state owns nearly all of Sapelo's 30 square miles. There is still no bridge. The only way onto the island is the state ferry, which crosses the Sound from the mainland several times a day. In the middle of the island sits the community Reynolds had gathered together in the 1940s when he consolidated Sapelo's scattered black settlements into one. It is called Hog Hammock, and it covers 434 acres, less than a single square mile. It is the last intact Gullah Geechee community in Georgia's Sea Islands, and, among the last anywhere, a place of dirt roads and modest houses lived in by the direct descendants of the people brought to Sapelo from West Africa in 1802 to the cotton plantation of Thomas Spaulding, the same Spaulding whose mansion Coffin had rebuilt. Somewhere between 30 and 50 of those descendants still live there full-time. In 1996, the community was placed on the National Register of Historic Places, the nation's official list of the places it has agreed to treasure. Being treasured has not been enough to keep it safe. In the 1990s, the county drew special zoning rules around Hog Hammock, holding new houses small in order to hold property taxes low so that the descendants could afford to stay. Then, in 2023, the county reversed itself. It voted to double the size of houses allowed in Hog Hammock, which would raise the value of the land, which would raise the taxes on it, which would, in time, price the descendants off the island exactly as the developers of St. Simon's had once priced out the families of Harrington. Investors had already begun to look at Sapelo the way they had once looked at Hilton Head. The residents did not accept it quietly. They sued and lost and sued again. They gathered more than 2,000 signatures to force the question to a public vote. The county went to court to stop the vote, and a judge halted the election while ballots were already being cast. The residents carried the case to the Supreme Court of Georgia, and in 2025 the court ruled in their favor. And in January of 2026, in a county-wide referendum, roughly 85% of those who voted chose to repeal the ordinance and restore the old protections. It was a victory. It was also a fragile one. The commissioners suggested that a repeal might leave Hog Hammock with no building limits at all, and the county's assessors had already begun, that same winter, to raise the appraised value of the community's land. Some parcels by nearly tenfold, over 3 years, beginning in 2026. The fight to remain on the island was not over. It had only entered its next phase. And in the middle of that fight, the island suffered something worse than any ordinance. On a Saturday afternoon in October of 2024, during Cultural Day, the annual festival at which the community gathers to celebrate its own survival, the aluminum gangway leading to the Sapelo ferry dock gave way. As many as 40 people were standing on it. At least 20 fell into the water. 7 of them died. Every one of the dead was older than 70, and one was 93. And none of them lived on the island. They had come only to honor it. The dock was 3 years old. It had been built after the residents of Hog Hammock sued the state to make the ferry they depended upon accessible to the elderly and the disabled. Among the men who went into the water and formed a human chain to pull the drowning to safety was a resident who had spent years fighting the county to keep his community on its land. It was the other end of the same story the coast had been telling for 100 years. The geography that had made these barrier islands into private refuges for the powerful, Jekyll for its 100 millionaires, Sea Island for the Joneses and a president, had made this one island the last refuge of the people that whole world had been built upon. On Sea Island, the descendants of the enslaved had been zoned and priced away. On Sapelo, they were still fighting, vote by vote and house by house, to stay on the ground their ancestors had been carried to in chains. Coffin had bought everything around them a century before and left them where they stood. They were standing there yet. And the state that owned the island around them had not managed to keep a 3-year-old Doc from drowning 7 of the people who came to celebrate them. 3 islands, then, lay along the same stretch of Georgia coast, shaped by the same marsh and the same history, and each had come to a different end. 3 islands, 1 coast, 3 verdicts. Jekyll had been the first and the most famous. 100 men had gathered behind its gate, holding by one reckoning 1/6 of the wealth of the world, and in a clubhouse there they had quietly drafted the plan for the nation's central bank. Then the club died, and the state of Georgia took the island, and today anyone with the price of a ticket can walk the same halls and rent a cottage where a Rockefeller once slept. Jekyll opened. Sea Island did not. The dynasty that built it fell, as surely as the club at Jekyll fell, ruined by the same reach for permanence that had ruined its founder before them. But when the Joneses lost the island, no gate swung open. It passed from a family to a consortium of investment firms to a billionaire from Colorado, and through all of it the causeway stayed guarded, the beach stayed private, and the rooms stayed priced beyond the reach of nearly everyone alive. Sea Island had changed hands 4 times over and remained, in the only sense that mattered, exactly what Coffin built it to be, a place the public could not enter, and Sapelo held on. On the island the state now owns, the descendants of the people brought there in chains still keep 434 acres, and somewhere between 30 and 50 of them still live on the land full-time, fighting the tax rolls and the zoning boards and the developers for the right to remain where their ancestors were never free to leave. The oaks outlasted all of them. On the Cloister lawn, the president's oaks still stand, each behind its small brass marker, a register of everyone the century agreed to call important. A few miles away, the older avenue of oaks still lines the drive to the golf club, set there generations earlier by people whose names were never written down. And on Sapelo, the live oaks still shade the dirt roads of Hog Hammock. The same trees, planted into the same coast across 200 years, mark the 2 kinds of memory the islands had always kept: the powerful, who came to be seen and remembered, and the people who made the ground and were meant to be neither. This was the thing the whole long story had been about. Coffin had wanted permanence, and the permanence he built outlasted his fortune, his marriage, his life, and the 3 generations of family that came after him. But it was never really about the Coffins or the Joneses or the Morgans and Rockefellers at Jekyll before them, or the consortium and the billionaire who came after. Those were only the hands that happened to be holding the gate. The thing that endured was the gate itself, and the marsh and the water that made a gate possible, and the plain, durable American preference the gate expressed. In this country, power has always preferred the places the public cannot follow: the winter island, the sealed summit, the guarded causeway. It has preferred them because they work, and because the geography that provides them does not care which family is in residence. It provides them still. Jekyll was the rare island that opened. Sea Island was the ordinary one that stayed shut. The causeway still crosses the marsh. The gate is still staffed. The oaks still grow. And on a smaller island, a short way up the same coast, a smaller number of people on a much smaller piece of ground are still trying to prove the opposite of everything Sea Island stands for. That a place in America might at last belong to the people who made it, and not only to the ones who can afford to keep everyone else out. They have 434 acres and the water at their backs, and they are still there.